I was born in New Zealand and grew up there in Auckland, which is not the capital, but it's the biggest city of New Zealand. Very easy place to grow up, especially back then. They will say like Britain 50 years ago. That's an exaggeration, but it's some truth in it. Went to high school there, just local state school. My father was a entrepreneur, is what he called himself. My mother called him a spiv. He wasn't a spiv. He was a very straightforward guy. But he was always looking for a new business opportunity. And that may be partly the background to some of my political opinions, because at that time New Zealand had a very, very highly regulated economy. My father's paid 66% taxation on the higher part of his income, and because he felt that the state was very burdensome, and so I guess I got some of that anti-state stuff that I have from that background. In fact, there are quite a lot of libertarians in New Zealand for a small country, and it may be that a lot of them were formed during that period. My mother didn't work. She was the daughter of a university professor, so she had she liked academia and all that kind of thing. That's why she called my father a spiv. She was kind of anti-business more. And although I was much more impressed by my father, as a kind of, he was more shaping my development, I may have picked up on some of my mother's sniffy attitudes towards business, because I've never really been, although intellectually I'm very pro-business, I got no business aptitude. A business opportunity could walk straight in front of me and I just wouldn't notice. So that's the family. I have one sister who's 5 years older than me and an artist. And she still lives in New Zealand, as everybody does, except my father, who's dead. So then I went to university in New Zealand as well, went to Auckland University, where I studied philosophy. And I studied philosophy just because I was very interested in it. And then I got more and more interested in it, and the degree went well, and so I applied to study in England to do a master's degree at Cambridge, which I did. And at that point, actually, I wasn't entirely sure whether I was going to go on and do a PhD. I went back to New Zealand. I worked for a year in New Zealand. I didn't really enjoy it. I was hankering after Cambridge and philosophy again, so I went back and did a PhD. And then the PhD went well, and so now I'm moving into the career part. And I got a job. I got a research fellowship at Cambridge, following directly on from my PhD at Corpus Christi College, and simultaneously a temporary lectureship in the philosophy faculty. And at that point, I was just planning to be an academic philosopher for the rest of my life. And probably about 2 years in to that fellowship and lecturing, I kind of started losing it. I didn't want to stay in academic philosophy anymore. And there were two reasons. One is horribly practical. I got married to a woman who's now my ex-wife, and money was terrible then in academia. It's much better now, actually. It's improved a lot. And also, I don't know, it wasn't, so there was the money. And also I felt, I don't know, there's something really petty, small about academic philosophy. Often about academia altogether, but academic philosophy, even more so. You enter philosophy with all these concerned about various issues and things. And then what happens is you start getting kind of taken over by the technique of modern philosophy, which is terribly technical. And in the end, you lose touch maybe with why you went into it in the first place. And so I was also, so not only was I feeling a bit poor, I was feeling a bit uninspired. And so I left. I joined a management consulting firm in London, and I still work for them now. I've quit a couple of times, gone back to live in New Zealand and done things, but I'm still back with that same company. And now I'm the head of research and publishing for the company. So that's my non-kind of writing background. Well, the first influence on my thinking was my father, just because he was interested in thinking. So we had at our house, we'd sit around at dinner, and my father would almost draw us into arguments on issues. And so arguing and discussing abstract topics was always part of the household environment. Well, not really, when I say the household, that's not fair. My sister wouldn't get involved, and nor would my mother. It was really my father and me. So he drew me into this as a kind of a practice, and then he also drew me, he had his ideas. And At first they influenced me, but not in the long run, not really. So he introduced me to real philosophers. He was a big fan of Bertrand Russell, gave me Bertrand Russell books when I was a teenager. And so in that sense, he introduced me to that whole kind of world. I can't say that in any particular way, ideas or anything come from him. The next big influence was my PhD supervisor. His specialist fields are time, probability, causation, broadly what he would call metaphysics. So not what are the laws of nature, but what is a law of nature. Not what causes what, but what is causation, so on. Now, that's the kind of stuff he did. And I worked in that kind of area as well. But what he taught me more than, again, it's not the content of what he taught me, it's the way of doing philosophy. And he too was part of a kind of a tradition. Some Cambridge people like to think it's a Cambridge tradition. I don't think it really is. It may have been exemplified at Cambridge, but it's much broader than that. And I guess what it is and I'd sum it up as being a no bullshit approach to philosophy. So no fancy words that are all dressed, none of that kind of poetic stuff. Very rigorous argument, clear, very clear. State your positions very clearly, make your arguments clear. It's commonsensical only in the sense, it's not, the theories aren't necessarily commonsensical, but you need the theories ultimately to conform with what we really know. So no crazy talk. There's a kind of philosophy sometimes ends up being crazy. That school in Cambridge is very informed by science, so they don't want to be at odds with the scientific worldview and so on. They're trying to elaborate that, expand on it, not the kind of French, I mean, it seems to me just like a branch of bad poetry or something. So it's an attitude, a way of doing it that he gave me. Then in terms of thinkers that people have really heard about, I want to pick out two. One is a philosopher who's very little known, and he was also an economist and mathematician. His name's Frank Ramsey. He was in Cambridge in the 1920s. He was a contemporary of Wittgenstein's and Russell's, and he died when he was only 26. It was a tragedy. Just a relatively simple medical error. He, between the ages of about 18, I think, or maybe 19, and 26, he achieved in mathematics, economics, and philosophy what most people don't get close to it in a lifetime of work. And my PhD on truth picked up on some very small comments he'd made and elaborated them into a full theory of truth and belief. But it wasn't just that I got from him, but there's a certain view of man and his place in nature and the way of understanding humans in what came to be known as naturalistic terms, seeing human beings as just another natural thing, and trying to give explanations or philosophical analyses of concepts like belief and so on, which are not spiritual in any way, they're just very ordinary. In particular, kind of behavioral, so they link states of mind to states of behavior, and that's something that I've kept right through. So that was a very big influence on what you might call my. Ramsey has got the philosophical worldview closest to mine, or I should put it the other way around. Mine closest to him. Then that's in philosophy. Then in economics and social theory and all that stuff, Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek, I discovered him much later, and when I would really stop doing philosophy and I'd become much more interested in other things. And it's the experience where you've got a whole lot of ideas here and there, and then you read somebody who's clearly had them too before you and put them into a much more coherent framework, and it all starts to hang together in ways that it hadn't before. I mean, that sounds almost like the experience people have when they read Karl Marx and they think, this explains everything. I think I was too intellectually mature by the time I discovered Hayek to have that experience. That's the experience of an impressionable 17-year-old, or just an idiot. But I'm incredibly. I normally, if I'm starting to think something, I think I'm having some new thought in my eyes, I might as well go and check out Hayek, because he probably already had it, and he'll probably put it into a better kind of framework than I do. So. Those are the Ramsey and Hayek, they're the two I would pick out in particular. I think it's a good test of whether you're still thinking, whether you change your mind. ever. If you don't change, I mean, because everyone changes their mind about trivial things, but I mean, something important, something that, and I don't know how, of course, as you get older, that should be less frequent, right? Because you've been thinking, you sorted out your opinions, and things don't change that much. But you should from time to time. And I hadn't asked myself, I just asked myself this, I hadn't been asking, and I realized that I haven't really. What's happened is I've filled out gaps in my knowledge. So I've got new opinions, definitely got completely new opinions, but they haven't, and those new opinions have somehow slightly changed, I don't know, the position or the emphasis on old ones. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean, but they put them in relocated some of my old positions. But have I completely changed any? I worry that I haven't. In one area I have, which is and it may seem a funny, narrow area, not important, but is in banking. Maybe people now think banking is more important than they used to. So I used to go along with the conventional view on banking, which is that you should have a central bank with some clever man like Alan Greenspan setting interest rates and controlling the money supply. I thought that was the right way of doing it. Why I thought that, I have no idea, because it's completely out of sync with my broader views, which is that prices, because interest rates are just prices for borrowing, should be set by market forces. But like so many other people, I kind of blindly accepted the status quo. Oddly, I accepted it as if it was somehow, set in stone, ancient, irreversible. In fact, it's incredibly modern. The status quo in banking is about 30 years old maximum, and it's not worked very well if you look at those last 30 years. So the crisis kind of came as a revelation to me in some ways. Again, I'm ashamed of that, it shouldn't, but it did. And I've been thinking very much hard about banking, and I have got very new views there. So I don't know if you count that as important or not, but I've got new views on banking. The other thing I've learned a lot about lately is what you call public choice theory. This is the theory about why politicians make the decisions they do. It gets away from the idea that they do it because they believe in it, and starts looking at how the various decisions serve their own interests. And that's a much more interesting way of understanding the political world around you than endlessly engaging in the ideological battles that they pretend are going on. That's often just a kind of bluff or a cover for the underlying machinations. So that's something that again I hadn't thought about at all in the past. In fact, I almost avoided it because I wanted just to indulge in the ideological argument. It seemed to distract from that. But it seems to me now a little childish to have avoided looking at it, because if you want to understand what's really happening in the world, you need to think about those things. The other thing I might mention is that I think I've become more of a pacifist. I never, no one likes to see people killed. But I think that what went wrong with my thinking, why I was too willing to go along with the idea of using military force, is World War II, oddly. World War II is held up as, and probably was, a perfectly just war from the point of view of the Allied side. And so you can get it into your head, and my father fought in that war, and as a little boy I was very keen on it, how boys have little model planes, all that stuff, hero worship element. But I really think that war was an incredible exception. I'm trying to think of any other wars that are unquestionably, where our getting involved was unquestionably the right thing to do. Usually, if you look at it, probably it was the wrong thing to do. And yet people are very glib about getting involved. Our politicians are very quick to get involved in using military force. And I believe, for example, in Iraq, that the best estimate of the death toll is 500,000 or thereabouts, right, for Iraqis. I mean, that is a staggering number of people. And to unleash that kind of death, or that kind of misery, you need to be really certain that you're right. And I think people are not nearly certain enough when they go into war now. And so that's nothing new. I haven't completely changed my mind, but it's something I think I'd say I'm much more of a pacifist than I was 5 years ago. If pacifist is probably the wrong word, but you know what I mean, anti-war.